Okay, so don't correct your screens. That really is the colour of the first slide. Thank you very much to CIAP for inviting me to speak today. And I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing trying to improve cochlear implant listening by providing sound information that's usually poorly transferred through the implant using vibration, haptic stimulation on the wrists. So the core challenge that the cochlear implant has is that it's trying to transmit sound information that in a healthy auditory system would be transferred using around 3,500 hair cells. It's trying to transmit that same information, but now using at most just 22 electrodes. So it's got a really, really tough challenge on its hands. And despite this, as most people here will be aware, the cochlear implant is remarkably successful. Particularly at providing, restoring speech perception in quiet listening environments. However, there are some key limitations of cochlear implants. So many cochlear implant users struggle to understand speech when there's a lot of background noise. And also many cochlear implant users have difficulties with spatial hearing. So problems locating where sounds are coming from and also separating out sounds that are coming from different locations. So what I'm calling the traditional approach to try to overcome these issues has been to try to find clever ways of getting more of the important information through that small number of electrodes. And that could be clever microphone techniques like beam forming, where the beam of the microphones is focused towards the sound source of interest. That could be clever signal processing techniques, or it could be clever techniques to improve the interface between the implant and the auditory system, the interface between the implant and the cochlea. So all of these approaches that I'm umbrellaing under the term the traditional approach, all of these approaches eventually hit up against a fundamental limitation, which is that there is only so much information it's possible to transfer through such a small number of electrodes. So we've been taking a slightly different approach. Rather than trying to find ways to get more information through that bottleneck of the implant, we've tried to get some of the information that the implant is poor at providing. We tried to get that to the brain via another route, and our other route is the sense of touch. So we're not the first people to try to provide sound information to hearing impaired listeners by using vibration, using touch. So back when cochlear implants were going through a rapid development in the 70s and 80s and through to the 1990s particularly, there was an alternative to the cochlear implant, which was called the tactile aid. So that's shown here. This is a tactile aid with a number of shakers around the abdomen. And what happened was that as the technology of the cochlear implant developed, particularly through the 80s and into the 1990s, the cochlear implant just outcompeted. It just had better outcomes than the tactile aid. And so by the mid to late 1990s and certainly by the early 2000s, the cochlear implant had all but wiped out the tactile aid as an alternative. And what we're really suggesting is that maybe rather than looking at these as alternative technologies, maybe we could consider them as potentially complementary technologies. So maybe we could use that vibration, that haptic stimulation to augment cochlear implant listening, to support cochlear implant listening. And it's also worth noting, of course, that since the 80s, when tactile aids were at their peak popularity, the technology has moved on hugely as well. So there's other opportunities for that reason as well, if we start looking at this again. Okay, so what have we been up to so far? So we've been focusing on those two key areas I mentioned earlier, trying to use haptic stimulation to improve speech and noise performance in cochlear implant users and trying to use haptic stimulation to improve sound localization in cochlear implant users. So firstly, I'll work on speech and noise. So this is a study with 10 cochlear implant users, and what we did is we measured their speech and noise performance with either audio alone or audio and haptic stimulation together. And we're using a multi-talker background noise in this experiment to try to get close to the sort of problem that we'd be dealing with in a real-world scenario. We measure their performance before and after a short training regime because we expected training to be quite important. And what we're measuring is the percentage of words they're able to recognize in noise. So we're trying to increase the percentage of words they're able to recognize in noise. So what we've done is we've fixed the signal to noise ratio individually for each participant, and I can talk in the questions a bit more about these methods if people are interested. What we've also done is we've included some deception in this experiment because we wanted to control for placebo effects, expectation effects. So what we did is we told the participants that in the audio-only condition, we were testing out our shiny new audio enhancement algorithm, and in the audio and haptic condition, we were testing out our new haptic stimulation approach. So that was just to control for the possibility that participants would perform better because they expected the haptic stimulation to help. The haptic signal, as I mentioned, we're presenting to the wrists, and what we focused on when we were extracting the haptic signal was providing more intensity information. So we extracted the speech amplitude envelope, the broad amplitude fluctuations in speech. And I can talk more about why we selected that sound feature, particularly in questions if people are interested in finding out more. We extract our haptic signal from the speech and noise signal, so we don't just take it from the clean speech signal. Again, we're always trying to keep an eye here towards something that we could eventually deploy in the real world. So we're taking it from the speech and noise signal, that haptic signal, and we're also using a signal processing approach that could process in real time on a compact wrist-worn device. Again, just keeping an eye towards a future real-world application. Okay, so this is what we found. So we've got this plot showing percentage change in the number of words recognized in noise. And this is each participant along here. And if you see a positive number, that means that haptic stimulation led them to get a higher percentage of words in noise. And if you see a negative number here, that means haptic stimulation made them worse. The light pink bars are before training, and then the darker bars here are after training. And what you can see is that before training, that on average at least, there really doesn't seem to be a lot going on. Some people getting a bit better and some people getting a bit worse, but on average, there doesn't really seem to be much going on. After training, though, the story is very different. So after training, nobody is getting worse anymore, and some people are really getting quite a lot better. So these two participants getting more than 20%, an increase of more than 20% in the number of words they were able to recognize when they had haptic stimulation versus when they hadn't. So some really big effects for particularly these individuals, and then on average the benefit was around 8%. So around 8% more words in noise when you've got haptic stimulation than when you haven't. So we were pretty happy with that, at least as a first effort at this. And hopefully you agree that there seems to be something quite interesting here to look at. Okay, so that was the speech and noise work. So now moving to sound localization. So we're using a slightly different concept here. So the signal extraction we did was actually very similar to what we did in the speech and noise work. But what we're doing now is we're extracting the signal received by devices behind each ear. And that's so that we can translate the sound localization cues, so we can translate them down onto the wrists. So I should apologize for this figure. This is from an article I did for children, so my apologies for the patronizing tone and sickening color scheme, but hopefully it gets the point across. So we've got devices behind each ear, and they are taking the audio and extracting haptic stimulation that we're delivering on each wrist here. And so you can see what would happen if there was a sound over to the right, an explosion in this case over to the right. That will be louder in the right ear than the left ear because the head gets in the way of the left ear, as I'm showing here. So the sound will be louder on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. That will be translated down to the wrist. So if the sound's over to the right, the vibration will be stronger on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. If the sound's over to the left, the vibration will be stronger on the left-hand side than the right-hand side. So by comparing the vibration across your wrists, the intensity of the vibration across your wrists, you can work out where the sound has come from. So that's the idea. So we brought in 12 cochlear implant users to test this idea. So of the 12 cochlear implant users that took part in this experiment, they were all implanted in one ear, which is which most cochlear implant users in the world are implanted in only one ear. And around half of them, just under half of them, had a hearing aid in the other ear. So we always leave them. We don't deviate from their natural setup, the setup that they use in their everyday life. Whatever they use in their everyday life, they use in this experiment. So our participants come in, they sit in an anechoic chamber that I'm showing this schematic here, and they face forward with a ring, a semicircle of loudspeakers around them that are shown here. And what they need to do is tell us which loudspeaker the sound came from. And they do that either using audio alone, audio and haptic stimulation together, or haptic stimulation alone. So they're the three conditions we're testing. And the outcome measure here is localization error. So how far off, on average, were they from the correct loudspeaker position. And we do this after 15 minutes of training for each condition. So we train them for 15 minutes on each condition, and then we do our testing. And this is what we found. So this is localization error. So obviously a large number is bad. This is audio only, audio and haptic only. And what you can see is that in the audio only condition, there's a lot of error. And that goes down really quite dramatically when they've got haptic stimulation in addition to the audio. So there's a really big effect here. So that's a great start, I think. What you can also see here is, which I think is a very interesting effect as well, is that participants are doing better when they've got audio and haptic stimulation together than when they've got haptic alone. And that's despite the fact that they're quite poor with the audio alone. So the reason that's really quite encouraging for us is because it suggests that our participants are integrating that audio and haptic information, which is exactly what we want to see if this is going to become something that they can use out in the real world and in their everyday lives. Slight warning on this effect. It's not a hugely significant effect. Worth noting that this is after multiple comparisons correction, though, so it may be a little bit more robust than that p-value makes it look. But all the same, to have full confidence in that effect, I think you would want to repeat this, but it looks encouraging all the same. Okay, so now trying to put that, so we got them to a performance of 22.7 degrees RMS error after our short training regime, after our 50 minutes of training. But how good is that? So we've improved their performance a lot, but how good have they got? Well, the performance has become somewhat comparable to that of bilateral hearing aid users, which is very, very promising indeed for us. So their performance there fairly close to the performance of bilateral hearing aid users. Worth noting that training there as well. So the bilateral hearing aid users in the studies we're comparing to in these studies had been using their devices for many years, whereas in this study they've been trained using haptic simulation for only 15 minutes under audio and haptic together. So that's quite a favourable comparison, I think. What's also a really favourable comparison is this comparison between the performance we've got here and the performance of cochlear implant users who have implants in both ears, or who have an implant in one ear and normal hearing in the other. So we're doing markedly better than that patient group, which is really, really encouraging. I think that suggests we could help using this approach. We could help potentially quite a large part of the cochlear implant user community. So that's I hope you agree, a very positive finding as well. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to address before I finish up is what sound localization cues are they using? Is their tactile system are they using through haptic stimulation? What sound localization cues were they using, and how sensitive are they to those cues? So there's two main cues they could be using. I already mentioned one. One is intensity differences between the ears. So the fact that if the sound's over to the right, it's more intense in the right ear than the left ear. So they could be using that. The fact that the vibration would be stronger on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. And they could also be using time differences. So the fact that if a sound's over to the right, it will arrive at the right ear before the left ear. So they could be using time or intensity difference cues potentially in this experiment. They're both available through vibration on the wrist at least. So we wanted to measure how sensitive they were to these cues. So we're measuring the minimum detectable time difference across the wrists for haptic stimulation at each wrist, and the minimum detectable intensity difference. And we're doing this for two different frequencies. So we're doing this for sinusoidal stimulation, tonal stimulation at 100 hertz. So that's the lowest frequency that you're likely to get from a compact motor that we might use in a device in the real world. And then the other frequency we test at is 250 hertz. 250 hertz is selected because that's the frequency that you're most sensitive to haptic stimulation, but it's also the frequency above which vibration starts to become quite audible. If you present it around at above about 250 hertz, it starts to get quite easy to hear, which is something we ideally want to avoid in our in any device we create in future. So we're doing the measurements for 2 frequencies. We're also looking at different age groups. So we've got our younger group, who are aged between 20 and 30 years old, and then our older group aged between 50 and 60 years old. So we want to check if people are sensitive to these cues. We want to check that that's not something that's declining with age, because obviously we want to be helping people across the age range if we can with this approach, not just refining to the younger age group. Okay, so this is what we found. So these are intensity differences. And what I'm showing you in blue, the blue triangles, is the older age group, so our 50 to 60 year olds. The minimum tactile intensity differences they can detect across their wrist. The circles, the red circles, are the younger age group, and that dotted line along here is the sensitivity of young, normal hearing listeners to intensity differences across the ears. And there's a few things you can see straight away. So you can see, one thing you can see is that there doesn't seem to be much change across frequency. So the frequency we present at doesn't seem to be too important. There doesn't seem to be much difference across the age groups either. So that's really encouraging, because we don't want this sensitivity to be declining with age. And what's also really, really encouraging is that the sensitivity to intensity differences across the wrist is actually really, really similar to the intensity difference sensitivity across the ears. So I think that's a really, really encouraging finding. Suggests that intensity differences across the wrists are somewhere that we should be able to get some really good sound localization accuracy by exploiting that sensitivity. The story for time differences, as many of you might have anticipated, is very different. So you're incredibly sensitive to time differences across the ears, on the order of microseconds, which is why this dotted line now looks like it's down at 0. And you're just miles away from that with the tactile system. So you're able to detect differences of around 30 milliseconds if you're a young participant. And then you can see that to make it even worse, you get worse as you age as well. So this doesn't look like a viable route for at least directly presenting sound localization cues. It looks like the thing to focus on is intensity differences and not time differences. Okay, so to wrap up, so the first thing that I hope I was able to convince you of is that it looks that there's some really promising evidence that we could perhaps improve speech and noise performance for cochlear implant users using haptic stimulation on the wrists. Hopefully I managed to convince you that at least that there's some real promise there. It looks like we can improve sound localization really quite a lot in cochlear implant users, again using vibration on the wrist. I hope I managed to convince you of that as well. The sensitivity, the cue, the sound localization cue that you seem to be using and that you're highly sensitive to is intensity differences across the wrist. So that should be where our focus is, I think, in terms of what we're providing through tactile stimulation. And encouragingly, this sensitivity doesn't seem to decline with age, at least for people up to the age of around 60 years old. Okay, so in terms of future work, there's a number of areas we're looking into, but one of the core focuses we have at the moment, which is what I've been hinting at all the way through, is that we're trying to get towards a device that we can use out in the real world, so a wristband that we can do some real-world trials with. And this is our current design that we are hoping to 3D print very soon and start getting ready to do some real-world trials with that. So this is a wrist-worn device with 4 different motors around the wrist, is what you can see there. So that's where we're moving with this. Okay, so I just want to thank there's loads of people I should thank for helping with this work, but I particularly want to highlight these 3. So Amma, who is a wonderful student, and without Amma, we probably wouldn't have been able to get this project going at all. So we have a huge debt of gratitude to her. She did the work on speech and noise performance that I presented at the start. Robin Cunningham, another fantastic student who did the sound localization work. And then Jana, who did the work on cue sensitivity, so sound localization cue sensitivity, and was unfortunately she was a research assistant with us and was abruptly hauled back to Lebanon because of the pandemic, but did an amazing amount of work in a short amount of time before that. I should also thank Carl Vashaw, who has been wonderfully supportive from the start, and also Soren, who from Oticon, who's been fantastically supportive, and Sam, who increasingly is just fundamental to this project. This is the work we published so far, so this is all open access, so easy to get hold of. I just want to quickly highlight these two reviews particularly. So this one focuses on the state of the field at the moment, and this one is more about how to build a device and the considerations when building a device. This is our project site, which we update regularly, and I think I am now going to appear in the present, possibly wearing a different shirt to answer your questions. And thank you very much for listening.